All right. So I just finished listening to the book Silence by Shusaku Endo, which was written in the 60s about Portuguese missionaries, Catholic Jesuit missionaries to Japan in the 1700s. And it's recently been made into a motion picture by Martin Scorsese, which I watched my initial kind of exposure to this. It's very, very, very thought-provoking, very difficult to watch the story. And I'm going to go ahead and just tell you the story. If you haven't watched it, you should go ahead and stop this. Or if you haven't read this book, you should go ahead and stop this. And I'm going to spoil it. So don't listen to this if you don't want me to spoil the story. But the plot of the story is ultimately it's relatively simple, actually, in the sense that it's two young Catholic missionaries who sail from Portugal to Japan. Very difficult journey, very difficult times, and they arrive in Japan, which had for roughly, I guess, maybe a century or so. I don't remember all the dates. I listened to it, so I don't remember all the dates. Had been evangelized by Catholic missionaries, beginning with Francis Xavier. And there were, at one point, evidently hundreds of thousands of Japanese Catholics. But over the course of 30 years prior to the events of this story, the Japanese authorities had instituted ruthless persecutions of Christians, killing an extraordinary number of them, torturing priests, and the stage is set with the news that a particularly important and prominent priest, Father Ferreira, has apostatized or renounced his faith and is living in Japan. So there's rumors about this famous father or priest having renounced the faith. So these two young missionaries go both to bring the gospel, both to serve the sacraments to the people of Japan, which predominantly I think it has taken off in the peasant people group of Japan, who were at the time terribly, terribly oppressed and impoverished. Long story short, the two Father Rodriguez, he's the main character. They make it there. They live in secret, serving peasant communities. They meet a man named Kijijiro, who is kind of the Judas player in the story, who winds up ultimately betraying Rodriguez to the authorities. And Rodriguez is put in jail, and he is asked to apostatize. And the heart and the kind of the climax of the story is building to the spot where he's actually given an interview with Father Ferreira, and he is repeatedly told to renounce his faith, and is put in a cell where basically he is within earshot of 4 Japanese peasant Christians who are being tortured. It's called the pit. They hang them upside down by their ankles and cut small cuts underneath the back of their ear, so they bleed out very, 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 very slowly, not fast enough to actually die. But so they're hanging upside down in a pit filled with feces, bleeding out, and the blood runs through their nose and into their mouth. So they are just hanging there, being tortured for days. And he has said, as long as you don't renounce your faith, these people are going to stay there, basically. And the character ultimately apostatizes. He renounces his faith. He steps on the fumi, which is an image of Christ that the Japanese officials were using to get people to physically renounce Jesus by putting their foot on it and trampling on it. And they're kind of and so then the story kind of goes on from there, and you hear a little bit about the end of his life. But that's really this question: how do the Japanese get these Catholic priests to apostatize? They do it by torturing Japanese Christian peasants, and it brings in these powerful questions that kind of are woven beautifully throughout the novel and powerfully throughout the novel, of the question of silence, and the silence, the face of Christ, and this chasm between the inner and the outer. So the character wrestles throughout with this, and they're all connected. They're actually all these themes are connected, but wrestles throughout with the silence of God in the face of the suffering of his people, and why. And so what you have here in all these wrestlings with this silence is this preceding knowledge of God, which is based on the Rodriguez's belief that God has in fact spoken. Right, God has spoken and said things about himself. He has done things that Rodriguez believes he knows God's character and he knows God's self. And yet in the present, what he sees, God doesn't act. So there's a disjunct or a chasm between the inner life he knows about God and believes, and what God is actually doing in the present, which is nothing, silence, right? He's not coming to the aid of the Japanese Christians who are being tortured. And so this separation that the silence creates between the inner and the outer, the truth of someone's interior life, God's interior life, and then the actual external silence of God. The same theme is kind of mirrored in what eventually becomes the role of Rodriguez. He apostatizes, he renounces his faith, but he inwardly, and it's made very clear in the book. It's made less clear in the movie, but in the book it's made clear that he holds on to his faith. Externally, he has renounced his faith. He is known as apostate, but inwardly, he's held on to his faith. And the appendix is weird. It's really difficult to understand exactly because the author writes it in a variety of methods. Some was diary, some was just this omniscient third person narrator, and then finally the appendix is written in like boring government prose. And listening to it, it was very hard to follow. I need to go back and listen to it again, but it sounds like the reality is that even throughout his life as a publicly apostate Christian, Rodriguez was secretly still running a Christian community and serving Jesus. So there's this separation between his external renouncing of the faith. So he's publicly an apostate, but inwardly he still has his faith. And he's done this, remember why? Because this was the price of those peasants being tortured. And he ultimately he realizes that it's a selfish thing for him to hold on to his public faith, his public orthodoxy, and his public confession of faith, that it would be selfish to hold on to those at the cost of these people's suffering. So really powerful, and I'm not really sure. I'm not saying what I think about it. It's a very powerful problem because it's also mirrored by one more kind of separation or disjunct. And this is an argument made by the Japanese officials and the repeated assertion that Christianity simply can't take root in Japan. And that is, the officials repeatedly tell him, and Father Ferrero tells, who's the other apostate, tells him that the Japanese Christians who publicly, externally pronounce, they confess the faith, they seek the sacraments, they love Jesus, and they worship, they confess the Christian faith, right? Externally, but the argument is again and again, they actually don't believe what the Catholic Church teaches or what the Christian Church teaches. Their beliefs are, they've taken the words of the Catholic faith and the words of the Christian teaching, and they've kind of fit them into their own categories. And so really they're still kind of worshiping the sun. And so there's this other question, like, is it possible that these peasants who are obviously not people who are literate or have education or even, rigorous, they're very different background and understanding. Is it possible that they externally profess their faith, but in reality don't have it? That the opposite of silence, they have faithful, incredibly suffering, long-suffering, faithful confession that somehow isn't a real faith, right? So there's this problem of the separation between the inner life and the inner reality. What are their real ideas? Do they have the requisite ideas? Which the Japanese officials say, no, they didn't. They completely misunderstood it. They're still, shamanistic pagans or whatever, who say the Catholic words but don't actually mean the Catholic things. And so that's kind of one of these themes that this book really wrestles with in powerful, and there's more to say about it. But ultimately the kind of core lesson that the character is wrapping his mind around is the reality that there's the face. That's the other theme that, so we've talked about the silence and then the separation between inner and outer, but then the face. Throughout the book, the priest meditates on the face of Christ and thinks about the face of Christ, and he loves the visual image of Christ in his mind, and he pictures him strong and powerful. And what's the climax of the story is when he's told to trample on the Fiumi, which is a picture of Christ. And this picture is Christ utterly exhausted and weak. And in the story, the way Endo tells the story, the image itself finally breaks the silence of God in that image. In fact, I should have it here to read to you. But basically, the image says, trample on me. It was to be trampled on that I came into this world. And so the priest comes to know Christ in renunciation, even by now for the priest, for Rodriguez, by his Catholic community, by the church that has now expelled him, then he's outside. But he meets Christ in the weakness of his face rather than the strength and power. So that's another theme that's important, and I've butchered it and not conveyed it as well as I might have, because honestly, I'm still kind of processing it. But very good book and very thought-provoking and powerful, and raises some really interesting questions. So with that, let you go.